Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. We are honored to be joined today by Dr. Ahmed Shaheed, the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. Dr. Shaheed, nearly a year ago to the day, released the first ever United Nations Human Rights Report wholly dedicated to anti-Semitism. Dr. Shaheed will be in conversation today with Felice Gair, Director of AJC's Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights, to assess the impact of this historic report. After we hear from Felice and our esteemed guest, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Felice, you and Dr. Shaheed have the floor.
Thank you very much, Daniel. As you've heard, our guest today, Dr. Ahmed Shaheed, wrote the UN's historic report on global anti-Semitism. You may not know, but he is a former foreign minister of the Maldives. And during his time in office, he encouraged his country to embrace international human rights. Following a political upheaval in his country, he was forced to seek refugee status in the United Kingdom. Today, he is the Deputy Director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex in England. Since 2016, Dr. Shaheed has served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. Prior to that, he served for 6 years as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on human rights in Iran. In 2018, Dr. Shaheed announced that he planned to write a report on global anti-Semitism and its impact on human rights. Our organization, AJC's Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights, organized expert consultations in both 2018 and 2019 in Geneva, New York, and Washington, drawing on our own expertise and that of our AJC colleagues from around the world. This provided Dr. Shaheed access to leading scholars, key international and local monitors, Jewish community representatives, and experts to help him complete his study. In September 2019, when Dr. Shaheed published his report, AJC's press release called it historic, and they were right. His report comprehensively and accurately describes and condemns anti-Semitism as a serious global human rights problem demanding urgent action. This reminds us that under the right circumstances, engagement on important human rights issues at multilateral organizations can produce results. We are delighted today to have an opportunity to discuss the report directly with Dr. Shaheed and to reflect on what has occurred in the year since he published that report. Dr. Shaheed, I have some questions for you. The United Nations Special Rapporteurs have been called the eyes and ears of the UN's human rights system because they can be independent and draw attention to problems, to human rights violations, and they can advise on ways to address those problems. Could you please describe to us the scope of your mandate and your role in the UN system, and what led you to decide that a standalone report on global anti-Semitism was necessary?
Good afternoon, all. Thank you, Felice, for that generous introduction and for this question. I'm really honored to be on this platform to talk about my report. Before I respond to your question, I want to just express my gratitude and thanks to the Jewish communities who engaged with me in writing the report and giving me access to their concerns, the information they had, and of course, working with me in developing a report that I believe should always be developed in participation with the concerned community. Of course, all errors and omissions are entirely my fault, but I want to thank at the start the communities for supporting my work. My UN mandate is to promote respect for international human rights law and standards in relation to the right to freedom of religion or belief, as stated in the key texts, especially the 1981 UN Declaration on the elimination of all forms of intolerance and of discrimination based on religion or belief, monitor trends in regard to its implementation, advocate on behalf of those whose rights are being violated, and recommend to states measures that would promote respect for freedom of religion or belief for all. In doing this, I undertake country visits, consultations, thematic studies, and engage with governments through a range of communication tools, and report annually both to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva and to the UN General Assembly in New York. I decided to write a standalone report on anti-Semitism for a variety of reasons. On taking office as the rapporteur on the current mandate, I found that my mandate, going back now over 2 decades, had almost no engagement with Jewish communities on violations, including about anti-Semitism. And that was evident to all, this in the rising trends in anti-Semitic violence, that there need to be done. And of course, the complexity and intensity of anti-Semitic hatred required a dedicated, focused analysis, and the basic tools that we have to develop to combat anti-Semitism are transferable to addressing all forms of hatred and bigotry. And my mission was to demonstrate that the human rights framework has to be applied to address anti-Semitism that was, surging across the globe at the time, and still is. So my motivation was to demonstrate that we need to address this issue now, urgently, because this is a challenge that affects not just Jewish communities, but everybody where we leave it unchallenged.
And as you researched the subject, Dr. Shaheed, what did you find?
Well, what I found most disturbing was that everywhere this was a problem. In countries, even in countries where there wasn't a Jewish population resident, anti-Semitism was very, very widespread. Global North, Global South, culture, religion, doesn't matter. Across the political spectrum, there were expressions of anti-Semitic hatred, and the variety of forms in which it was manifesting itself, not only complex, but also multiplying all the time. But what really disturbed me was the level of violence that was attached to anti-Semitic hatred, and that call for immediate urgent action, especially in countries where we call open societies. The level of violence seemed to be even more than perhaps in societies where it was less easy to organize, to have organized hatred.
Dr. Shaheed, could you recall for our audience some of your key recommendations and what responses you've received from different stakeholders? In particular, in your report, I know you called on states to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition on anti-Semitism. And if you could tell us something about whether states did adopt it, how many, what we can do to advance this, and also other recommendations that you made.
Yeah, thank you. I make a number of recommendations that specifically target a range of actors and stakeholders, from governments, international organizations, to businesses, media, educators, and civil society. And they're all framed as human rights obligations or responsibilities, depending on the actor concerned. I call on states, for example, to strengthen the legal framework and increase monitoring of anti-Semitic hate crimes and take preventive and remedial measures. I call on the UN to appoint a top-level official to address anti-Semitism, including coordinating UN's efforts and monitoring global trends in anti-Semitism. I call on social media and tech companies to make more rigorous efforts to apply terms of service and community standards to combat the spread of anti-Semitism. I call on politicians and non-government organizations to refrain from anti-Semitic hate speech and to stand up in solidarity with those targeted by hate speech and always condemn and reject anti-Semitism wherever they encounter it. I call on educators to join in the fight against anti-Semitism by learning from Jewish groups already doing great work in this area, and to develop further empathy-based learning and peer-to-peer exchanges to dissolve stereotypes and prejudice. And I call on all these groups to endorse the working definition developed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and to use it in the way that the IHRA has recommended it as a non-legal tool for educational purposes to facilitate informed and effective responses to anti-Semitism. Since my report was published and presented this time last year, Argentina, Cyprus, Italy, Sweden, Greece, Serbia, Spain, and Uruguay have all announced they've adopted the working definition, bringing the number of states now that embrace the working definition to some 26, which is a good figure, but I think we need to do more. So some of these countries, of course, adopted the definition after reaching out to me. Many have since and haven't yet completed the process. But I think we must all do more to demonstrate that the IHRA working definition is comprehensive and that it can address anti-Semitism while still protecting free speech and also contributing to eliminating anti-Semitic hatred. At the same time, enable the societies to build societal resilience that will help them to combat all forms of hatred. So I think it's important that we create more awareness in this area and perhaps work with UNESCO, which is doing great work in promoting combating anti-Semitism through education. So I would think that more awareness raising by civil society groups is essential to ensure that more and more countries recognize the importance of the IHRA working definition and embrace that.
Thank you, Dr. Shaheed. Let me ask you an undiplomatic question. Are you satisfied with the responses from these different stakeholders?
Well, I'm never satisfied until the whole job is done. But I think I'm encouraged by the responses many countries have given. Nearly all these countries have fully adopted the IHRA working definition, and many are, like I said, working on this. So I think rather than saying I'm satisfied with it, I think I'm encouraged by it. And I am determined, therefore, to work with Jewish communities worldwide to do more in this area, to encourage more states to adopt the standards and also to implement this. It's important that these states not just say we endorse it, but invest in efforts to really disseminate it to all parts of the country or community and make sure that what results is actual progress from doing this.
Thank you. Well, the world has certainly changed a lot in the last year. Really, we're facing so many monumental challenges, and the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, has caused an explosion, really, an explosion in online hate speech. We've seen deepening political tensions here in the United States and elsewhere, along with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and hate propaganda spreading in this context. It's been a very difficult year. Dr. Shaheed, you were the first international figure to raise the alarm about the dramatic rise in anti-Semitic conspiracies concerning COVID-19, as I recall. Can you comment on these trends? Can you tell us if they surprised you and if there were any particular aspects of these trends that you consider especially troubling?
In the statements I issued in April, in fact, 2 statements, I expressed my deep alarm. I say I was deeply disturbed by the surge and the explosion in anti-Semitism following and during the COVID pandemic. And this was global. It amounted to incitement of discrimination and violence, and there were reports of people being motivated by this incitement to develop plots of violence against Jews. And as always, this was dangerous. And of course, as always, and before as well, such scapegoating doesn't end with Jews. And we saw very quickly after the scapegoating of Jews went global, and then other communities were targeted, from the Baha'i to Shia, Sunni, Hindu, Christians, and so on. And this xenophobic explosion, racist explosion, threatened everybody, and that's how racism works. It just goes from one to the other, targeting whoever is in the weakest position in a given society. And of course, I was encouraged by those who stood up and rejected this, but I was more alarmed by the dissemination of it online and offline, and the way in which it was impacting upon the lived realities of many communities. And I saw this on print media. I saw it on TV channels, state TV channels. Of course, the online dimension in all its platforms, it was going on. And of course, there were people who can call religious leaders, perhaps albeit fringe leaders, also joining the fray. So it was disturbing, it was alarming, and therefore something had to be said. And I issued one statement just on anti-Semitic hatred, another one on other elements, including anti-Semitic hatred, back in April.
Dr. Shaheed, can you tell us a little bit more about the reactions by government leaders and political figures to your call to them to publicly reject and counter anti-Semitic speech? As you mentioned, you've made at least 2 statements this year as well. Have the reactions been adequate?
Again, adequate isn't a word I would use, nor can I use it, because the determination of adequacy here would be by the affected communities. And there was no palpable improvement really in many situations. And partly because, coming from previous times, there were government leaders who were actively encouraging this. I think you would recall Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia 1 year ago in Oxford, a lecture he gave, speaking, expressing very anti-Semitic racist remarks. And then of course this year, Iran's supreme leader's tweet, again, highlighting that trend of people in power using anti-Semitic discourses. But on the positive side, I should say that we should note the positive developments as well. A number of countries have strengthened their commitments to combat anti-Semitism, and they have done a variety of things. They've appointed special envoys to focus on these, and many have spoken out. And examples can be, we can find examples from, say, Canada, US itself, France, and Germany, where public officials were quick to condemn anti-Semitic incidents and rhetoric. And of course, in these countries and elsewhere in Europe, law enforcement authorities responded promptly to threats and acts of violence against Jewish people. And so therefore, there was a positive trend, but of course, the old hatred continues, and some of the actors continue without much challenge. And I think the challenge before us is to make sure that those who would ignore this call and engage in anti-Semitism stand shamed by the world opinion. And that's something I think we can do.
Dr. Shaheed, as you've pointed out, there really is a disturbing amount of hate propaganda spreading online right now, from right-wing conspiracies that are anti-Semitic and otherwise, to Holocaust denial, propaganda against religious minorities worldwide. Social media companies, frankly, are profiting from more engagement on their sites during this time. And their failure to curb hate propaganda so far has led some to say that they just don't have the will to stop it. Others say they don't have the expertise. I'm wondering if you share this concern and what you think Facebook in particular and other social media companies as well could be doing to address the claim that they are helping to amplify anti-Semitic hate speech. Do you think they can stop the spread of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and hate online? Do you think it's possible?
I think in response to this question, it would be good to bear in mind certain other considerations or principles or aspects here. One is, of course, the complexity of the challenge that we face with the online dimension. The other, of course, is the question of, as you mentioned, is the expertise there to address this? Is the normative framework sufficiently robust enough to deal with this? And of course, is there the will amongst this platform and their owners to address the issue here? And there may be the fact that, the response is going to be a complex one, but requires a lot of investment. So my tagline here is, with great power comes great responsibility, and these companies have not lived up to it. Of course, there are many things that can be done. And of course, I also note that over the past few months, tech companies have attempted to do a lot of things. The amount of anti-Semitic content taken down has been in millions, but that's because the amount posted far exceed the number taken off. And there have been attempts to integrate human rights standards in the work they do, but I think we still need to reiterate some basic calls to them. One is to insist that they strictly enforce the community standards and terms of service that they have set up themselves for this. And also simplify reporting procedures for those who are targeted by hate speech on these platforms. And clearly, before one can say whether the efforts are adequate or not, we need to have a better sense of what they're doing. So more transparency in what happens when a complaint is lodged and how they assess this and what gets done. That is important. I also think that they should make a strong commitment to international human rights law in how they address this, and not simply cite freedom of expression concerns, but recognize that human rights are indivisible, interdependent, interrelated, and therefore factor in concerns about non-discrimination and equality in their policies, and recognize that hate speech actually targets the protections against equality and non-discrimination. Therefore, they have to bring these considerations into how they do this. At the same time, they have to train their content moderators in spotting anti-Semitism. And here, of course, the IHRA working definition can be super helpful. And they must also invest more in greater community participation in standard setting and setting procedures. You have to work with the community affected to detect what's going on and be able to know that you actually responding well, because hate speech is often contextual, and therefore that investment has to be there. And of course, we are talking about a plurality of options here, including, of course, counter narratives that must be amplified and de-amplifying hateful narratives. But of course, apply the Rabat plan of actions, degree of harm, and where the hate speech threshold is crossed, then they have to consider banning them. Where the criminal threshold is being crossed, they have to make sure that these people cannot come back to the platforms and do that. But I say plurality of methods because we see that banning alone doesn't work, because these people then come back in either a different platform or other bypass methods and come back and do the same thing. So we need to have a plurality of options in dealing with hatred, but be very sure that those that cross the threshold of incitement to violence, hostility and discrimination cannot find a space on any of these platforms. And I also want to stress that it's not enough to say that the volume, speed, language, and context of hate speech is becoming diverse and more. I think a commensurate investment has to be made by these companies, which are making large amounts of profit, to make sure that with their power comes enough responsibility on their part and they discharge it effectively. So I think my short answer here is not enough is being done. I don't want to judge by saying they have no will, because they, in some cases they've been doing something, but it's not enough. And they really have to invest a lot more and to make sure that they become more transparent and more accountable to what they're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Shaheed. One of the key issues here has been the question of Holocaust denial. And many observers have been arguing that the algorithms that these social media companies use actually guide people to the pages of Holocaust deniers, not those seeking to remember the Holocaust and prevent genocide or anything of that sort. You speak about great power bringing great responsibility. I recall the movie Superman saying as much. And I'm wondering in that context, who's the Superman here? Is it the social media companies? Is it you? Or is it the legal systems in the states concerned?
I think to have the analogy here, Superman, we should not think of one person here. I think the way to address this is to really empower a multi-stakeholder forum to do this, because giving that power to any one party here could have complications. So I think the the informed expert advice here is to develop multi-stakeholder forums to ensure that the human rights law framework is applied, and that's important. You're right about some of the platforms using algorithms that will actually encourage, more face time with, more encounter with hate speech. And that's why I think it's important that there should always be a human in the loop in how they use algorithms, and to make sure that algorithms do not reinforce further discrimination. So again, there are methods out there which have been put forward or practiced in limited ways that can be helpful, but the scale is not there, and the commitment to really create these multi-stakeholder forums is not there. But I think there are good signs in the sense the UN Secretary General has just launched a global action plan and strategy to combat hate speech, and a key dimension of that is working on the online space. So I think by bringing human rights law to this field, and by ensuring more transparency, more accountability, we can begin to make some changes. There may not be a perfect answer, but certainly it could change the current unacceptable situation.
Thank you very much. I hope we can come back to this as well, that there'll be enough time to come back and talk further about this, or perhaps in another session. You know that the AJC's Advocacy Anywhere has already had a program with Miguel Moratinos, the UN Special Envoy, on this. It has also brought several of the anti-Semitism envoys from different countries together, and these are also making interesting suggestions as to public policy in the areas, but still the problem seems to be cascading. Dr. Shaheed, your report was notable in establishing that anti-Semitism is a global problem, and one that stems mainly from the far right, the far left, and radical Islamists. You cited those three sources in your report. And you present anti-Semitic acts as human rights problems, you said in your early remarks, not only in countries with substantial Jewish populations, but also in places where there are none. Can you offer us some advice from your own study? Where is anti-Semitism most persistent? Where is it not being addressed effectively? And what more can be done in those situations?
Right. Anti-Semitism or any other form of hatred becomes most persistent when there's impunity for such acts. And when governments fail to respond to such hatred, then obviously they create, I think, an open space for this to fester. That is where it becomes most persistent. In terms of where it is most dangerous is, I think, when we have to apply a human rights perspective here. And so look at from the community perspective, where Jewish communities live and feel unprotected and are open to incitement and are open to attack and face those attacks. That's when they, I think, when it's most dangerous. And ironically, and this may be a function of information being available, but ironically, in open societies, it appears to be far more easier to organize attacks against Jewish communities. And some of the most violent attacks have happened in these contexts, in these situations. The perpetrators have been a lot. I mean, a lot of quite frequently, far-right neo-Nazis are implicated in these violent attacks, but there have been times when, Islamists have also undertaken these attacks. So between these two groups, the violence is shared, but where it is most lethal is when society, when the government and the legal infrastructure isn't monitoring that and responding to that. But this can occur in societies where there are no Jewish persons present at all. And as a global problem, we can see in the language, in the discourses used, in the way they target the communities, the same sort of stereotypes and tropes being used. And why is that so dangerous? That's because in societies where we do not challenge this sort of racism, anti-Semitism, then we create the conditions in which there cannot be a society, there cannot be social trust. We, in fact, make that environment not habitable for democracy. So there's an, if you like, an irony here, a paradox here, in that we see the most violent incidents and the most, if you like, numbers of incidents in open societies, whereas in closed ones, you get the worst forms of, if you like, hatred. And of course, we should look at those countries which fall in either category, which is not an open society, which does have a Jewish population and which faces incitement from their leaders. At the community in Iran, when I was working as a reporter on Iran, I raised concern about the community's plight there. And of course, the government denies all this, but some facts become very, very, very clear. The depletion of the community and the fact that that despite overtures made by the government to show, if you like, their outreach to the communities, the country remains a very, if you like, country remains a leader in anti-Semitism. I mean, earlier in 2000s, when the UN declared the Holocaust Remembrance Day, Iran responded by hosting a conference of Holocaust deniers, leading the UN to have the following year condemn Holocaust denial as well. And then, like I said earlier, the Supreme Leader has been tweeting anti-Semitic rants. So I think in all these contexts, where there's impunity, there's danger. And when the communities are present and aren't protected, that's where I think anti-Semitism is the worst.
But there's no top 10 list in your report, is there?
I beg your pardon?
You don't have a list of the top 10 worst countries or anything like that in your report, do you?
I do not make a list of top 10 for the simple reason that the information is available only by those who monitor it. But in terms of countries that came to my, if you like, the incidents that led up to my report, or in the period I was writing this report, the incidents in the US, what was striking, incidents in France, in Sweden, in Austria, in Germany, all these were countries in which there were violent incidents. But in terms of the level of anti-Semitic harassment, that's a function of a country actually being good in monitoring them. So it's where there's a mechanism to monitor that. These are reported, or where the Jewish communities themselves do the monitoring. Again, here, underreporting is significant. So therefore, I thought rather than make a top 10 list, I would speak about the most dangerous sort of situations which required our attention.
Thank you very much, and you certainly do in the report. For anybody who wants, I have a copy of this report. It's online on the United Nations website, but there are also links to it on our website. We have a document which talks about the United Nations historic report on anti-Semitism, and there's a link to it, but you can Google it. Dr. Shaheed, long before you were appointed as the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, you understood that Jewish audiences, frankly, tend to doubt the United Nations' ability to play a constructive role in the fight against anti-Semitism. Many Jews see it as a source and an amplifier of anti-Semitism. At the consultations we organized for your study, many of the participants who themselves monitor anti-Semitic incidents recalled notorious and even recent UN-related incidents, ranging from statements by diplomats, by UN experts, as well as resolutions adopted by intergovernmental UN bodies. The IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism makes it clear that many of these were, in fact, anti-Semitic. Now, your report directed recommendations not only to governments and social media companies, but also to the United Nations itself. So I want to ask you if you've seen any progress at the United Nations in the past year in correcting any of the longstanding complaints about anti-Semitism at the world body. For example, we've already been talking about the appointment of a special envoy on anti-Semitism, which you had recommended for the post. I'm wondering how you view that appointment. Will you work together with the special envoy, and, for example, on training or on other kinds of inside activity to deal with this question of the United Nations itself being widely seen as an entity that has enhanced anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attitudes?
Phyllis, you're right about the UN system. Of course, I want to point out that the UN system is a very large multi-chamber, if you like, institution or family with many members. And different parts of the UN operate differently on different mandates, different rules, and different orientations. And some of these parts of the UN have a problem in terms of the way, they have done activities that can be called anti-Semitic, or in some case openly perhaps encouraged anti-Semitism in the work because of the work that they do. Other parts over the years have been far more responsive to these concerns and therefore have tried to rectify things. UNESCO is a good example where they are doing a lot of work now in combating anti-Semitism in school context, so really training policymakers to deal with this. The current Secretary General has been very vocal in his and very clear about his rejection of anti-Semitism and has done a lot of work to promote awareness about this, and his appointment of a high representative or a focal point is indicative of that support. I've had a few meetings with the high representative, and I'm sure I can work with him, and I intend to work with him. And like you said, embedding, I think, sensory training within the UN system to make the UN staff more aware of anti-Semitism, such as the IHRA working definition, could be a good start. And of course, you might know that even in the UN system, human rights training across the board has been a recent thing. So I think we need to add IHRA working definition into that mix and make them become aware of how different ways in which anti-Semitism can be manifested, and therefore respond to that. I am an honorary UN person, really, and so I'm really happy that there's a full-time mechanism within the UN now which can deal with this very challenging and urgent issue, and therefore I'm looking for all synergies I can have with him to advance my work, as I am doing with UNESCO and other parts of the UN system, as well as my colleagues in the Special Rapporteur system. So Rapporteur on Racism, 8 of us joined together for the first time this January to issue a statement to commemorate the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And then I was joined by several other rapporteurs in other statements that have come since on rejecting anti-Semitism. So I think there is a growing, if you like, recognition of the importance of addressing this issue within the UN system. And we just have to keep doing that more, pressing that further. And an important part also would be to reach out to member states, because the UN is as good as the governments that come to sit in there. And if we do not go out and engage with those societies, with those countries, then we really won't make a huge difference to what happens in the chambers, in the council, or in the assembly.
Dr. Shaheed, there are many other questions I wanted to ask you about Israel, about kosher slaughter, about coalition building to deal with this, but I see that we're essentially at the end of the time. We have to turn and open the program for audience questions. So I'll end my questions with you by just simply saying, what do you see in the future? How can you keep shining a spotlight on the threat of anti-Semitism at the UN, in the UN, and using the UN, and worldwide? And how can we help you?
Thank you. One of the things that stuck with me in this process while I was working the report was the very first meeting that you convened in Geneva, to which you brought in the High Commissioner himself and key, if you like, personnel from the Jewish communities, people like Rabbi Andrew Baker, Mike Wine, and others who were actually, the stalwarts of the community monitoring anti-Semitism and trying to work in this. And what I have noticed since is a growing engagement between various UN bodies, actors, and Jewish monitors. And that sense of working together is important. And I think that's the way we can keep moving forward. Now, for my own 2 cents worth, as it were, I intend to remain focused on my report for the remainder of my tenure as a rapporteur. I intend to work with Jewish communities worldwide to roll the report out in terms of awareness raising, focus on education, supporting various measures, including things not directly linked to anti-Semitism. So last year, for example, you were in The Hague on the Istanbul process meeting, designed to combat negative stereotyping, stigmatization, incitement to violence, and so on. And again, this is a UN, coming out of a UN initiative, but led by a cohort of countries, including US, Canada, UK, and Turkey, and Pakistan, to address incitement to violence. And here we find ways in which we can build certain resilience, monitor trends, and train people to combat hatred. So working with these different allies, different coalitions, different groups is the way I think we can make an impact. And my 2 years will be devoted to doing this. I hope to report back to the Council on what happened to my report, what states did with it, who didn't do much about it, and what other challenges remain. So I leave a way for people to come back and can take over from there. But in the time I'm on the mandate, I hope to work with Jewish communities, Jewish organizations, and other friends of allies of the Jewish communities in promoting the task of combating anti-Semitism and promoting, if you like, inclusion for everybody.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn the program now back to the moderator, Dan Silver, for viewer questions.
Thank you, Felice, and thank you, Dr. Shaheed. Our first question comes from Shrub Kempner in Galveston, Texas. Specifically, what do you recommend as steps to undertake after a country has accepted the working definition of anti-Semitism? And what have countries actually done, the countries that have already adopted it, what have they actually done since adopting it?
Thank you. It's a very important question, because what really matters is what they do after the adoption or endorsement of the working definition. And there have been a range of measures taken. Some have modified their legal frameworks, which is a very good thing to make sure that there is, if you like, enough teeth in what they've done. Most have disseminated locally into public bodies, other institutions, encouraged them to also embrace this. And most have, very helpfully, used awareness raising programs around that. So I think the key things would be to look at the working definition and to do as precisely as the IHRA recommends it to be done. Change the laws where the legal framework has a role in this, increase awareness raising and training for all sort of personnel, from judges to law enforcement to others, and of course use it as an educational tool for awareness raising. And I recommend to governments to have a coordinator in their bureaucracy, in an influential position, in a visible position, to be able to lead this process, because this requires constant engagement. This requires a focus. This requires a point at which the communities can and should engage with. So I think these are the things I would recommend for governments to do once they have embraced the IHRA working definition.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Ray Tarini in Dallas, Texas. Did your report address the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement? And if so, what recommendations do you have to combat this globally?
Thank you. My report refers to the BDS movement. I have 2 paragraphs on this, so I can't say I dealt with it, but I highlighted the concerns that are there about the BDS movement. I don't make a recommendation about it, but I suggest what can be done. And that is by showing that on the one hand, international law protects in principle the right to boycott as a principle. But on the other hand, the effects of such boycotts can be quite harmful, and therefore there's an obligation to mitigate or to avoid those effects. And I show that in the case of the BDS movement, regardless of the intent, and of course that can be questioned, but regardless of the intent, the effects are quite toxic, and therefore is a matter of concern. I also note that within the umbrella of the BDS are groups who have at various points expressed anti-Semitic racism. And I am paying that, despite many people protesting that they have a legitimate interest in pursuing this, they do not come out clearly and say that they accept the state of Israel, they accept that Jews have a right to self-determination. This is not being said. So at the minimum, as IHRA Working Definition says, if you reject the right to self-determination of Jewish peoples, then it cannot be anything other than anti-Semitic. So I draw these parameters, on the one hand, to protect it as a right in principle, but to highlight the concerns that are there, because the way we see it as a phenomenon is problematic. And my biggest concern, of course, was the toxic effects it was having on campuses. And I saw this, in a variety of contexts, through reading, through engagement, in first-hand experience, so on and so forth. So there are concerns about this that have to be addressed. Unfortunately, I don't have the space in my report to come to a ruling on this, but to point out that here are the parameters, and those who should rule on this must use these parameters to make a decision about what they do with the BDS movement.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Stefan Bloom in Brussels. In some European countries, we have recently seen efforts to increase and tighten restrictions that are already in place. For example, bans on kosher slaughter, and to place new restrictions on the practice of male circumcision. Do these developments concern you, and how have you encouraged governments to address these issues from a human rights standpoint?
Yes, my report talks about these concerns, and I am concerned about these trends. And what I have said is that the human rights framework, again, provides some answers in how this can be addressed. And with regard to kosher food, kosher meat, where there's accommodation to ensure that the communities concerned can access this food, that probably is sufficient. But the government has an obligation to ensure that access can be guaranteed for Jewish communities. That's an obligation the state has, and it can determine how it best does it. In terms of male circumcision, I question why it's an issue. Again, when it is framed as a right of children and a religious right, I again point out to them that they have to ensure that they engage with the concerned communities and really hear their concerns, so that they know the extent of the burden they could be imposing by that measure, and the impact it will have on that community. And there are state obligations coming from Article 27 of the ICPR about religious minorities and others that will obligate them to ensure they can exist and thrive in their countries. And so if the states took this measure, it would amount to an invitation to leave the country, essentially. So I don't see how the concerns as currently expressed from child rights perspective can in any way be equal, even outweigh the legitimate interests of Jewish communities in this practice. So for me, there hasn't been a persuasive response from those countries framing this legislation to justify that restriction.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Francis Hassan in Paris. You specifically have looked at and spoken out about anti-Semitism in Muslim majority countries. Can you speak to the unique nature of anti-Semitism in those countries and the response you've received?
Yes, the anti-Semitic hatred in Muslim countries comes in a variety of forms. There are those that come out of religious texts, the way they are interpreted and the way they are taught by some clerics, by some schools, some madrasas, and that's a matter of concern. But I think in the final analysis, that all links down to what we can call left-wing anti-Semitism, and also a history of engagement with the document about the Protocol of the Elders of Zion that is widely disseminated in the Middle East region, and that becomes a template upon which this discourse is built. And of course, the Israel-Palestine conflict is again used as an excuse to use Jewish communities as a proxy for the government of Israel. But the underlying narrative is, I would say, based on the conspiracy tropes that come from the protocol, but increasingly mobilized, increasingly used by radical Islamists by recourse to the religious texts that, in their perspective, justifies anti-Semitic hatred. So it's a complex situation, but one requires education and engagement to address this issue. There are many groups in these countries who reject these readings. There are many groups in these countries who reject the anti-Semitism that comes in other ways as well. So that is a specific problem. And my key recommendation here has been and will be to look at the IHRA working definition, to strengthen the rule of law, to protect everybody, and to address the discourse coming out of the schools. And of course, I should mention, there have been reports of imams using the pulpit to, again, preach anti-Semitic hatred. And this comes along with homophobia and so on and so forth. So again, there should be a clear understanding that the state has an obligation to prevent incitement to hatred and discrimination and violence.
Thank you. And following up on that, we have a question from a viewer who's asking about the growing normalization between Israel and Arab nations and how that might affect your work in the region, perhaps positively in some countries or negatively in other countries. Can you speak to that a bit?
That's actually, well, I haven't really thought about how that could affect my work, because my work is focused on engaging with Jewish communities. If there is less intensity in the Middle East of hatred towards Israel, of confrontation towards Israel, that would certainly help me, because then I would get access to these countries to engage with those communities. So I would hope that the UAE would have no difficulty now inviting me to their country to speak about my findings to various bodies in that group. And I hope other countries who normalize the relationship with Israel would also be open to me talking about left-wing anti-Semitism and other ways in which the conflict in the Middle East is used, instrumentalized by groups to perpetuate anti-Semitism. So I think I would see positive benefits that come from this move, because there should be more space opened up for dialogue, engagement, and for voice of reason.
We have time for a few more questions. Our next question comes from Lena Neville in New York. Your report endorses Secretary General Guterres' observation that, quote, where there is anti-Semitism, there are likely to be other discriminatory ideologies and forms of bias, end quote. Since your report on anti-Semitism was released last year, have you seen diverse groups coming together in shared recognition of it as a common threat, and what can be done to encourage more of this?
Yes, I think there are growing positive signs of the understanding that any form of racism is one that will engulf everybody else in the end. And therefore, likewise, anti-Semitism is not simply, or not only a problem for Jewish communities, it is a problem for everybody. I've seen Muslims and Jewish communities work together. I've seen Muslims, Jews, Christians work together. I've seen religious groups and civil society actors working together. I was in the Netherlands last year on a country mission, and at the Istanbul conference I referred to just now, we saw a number of initiatives in that country of imams and rabbis or Jewish communities and Muslims working together to demonstrate solidarity and to promote, if you like, solidarity amongst these groups. In the UK, the Muslims Against Anti-Semitism is a group that has come up that, again, stand up against anti-Semitic hatred. And of course, it goes both ways. There have been Jewish groups standing up against Islamophobic or anti-Muslim hatred in the UK. So this kind of cross-border, as it were, cross-border coalitions are happening. I welcome that. And that's really a very effective way of dissolving stereotypes, of dissolving, if you like, boundaries, and promoting empathy across different communities. And that's why I think that recognition by Secretary General is important, that we all should recognize that one form of hatred will lead to other forms of hatred eventually.
Thank you. We have time for two more questions. I'm going to pose them both to you since they're kind of connected. Our first is from Saul Cantor in Los Angeles. What is the biggest challenge that you have faced in your position and with this report specifically? And what do you think that challenge, will that challenge persist moving forward? And then Abby Wolf in Tulsa, Oklahoma asks, how might an NGO like the American Jewish Committee or others assist with your efforts?
Thank you. I think very important questions, both very important questions. Well, if I need to point out one big obstacle to me, I think the biggest obstacle is non-cooperation by governments. And here, of course, my work becomes most effective when the targets of my reports, i.e. governments, look at them and act upon them. And where they reject these findings or fail to work on them, I have a problem. So my biggest challenge, of course, is government non-cooperation with regard to my work. And of course, I'm open to have worked with all governments on this report and other reports as well. And where they are willing to let me into their country, talk to their communities, engage with them, that's when I would be able to do my work really well. In terms of what can be done to overcome that, that links to the second question. What can AJC, for example, do to support my work? And that comes again by recognizing the mobilizing power of civil society and organizations like the AJC in bringing diverse people together, in creating common understandings, in disseminating the message, in mobilizing people in other communities. So I think where governments are restrictive or non-cooperative or indifferent, I think we can mobilize civil society actors in disseminating the report. And in today's world, governments are one of many players in the global arena. And we have a lot of scope for NGOs to be effective. So broad coalitions of NGOs focusing on awareness raising of its community, those with specialist skills to train lawyers in this area in terms of working definition, judges, law enforcement. These are all things that can be done with the appropriate, if you like, institutions supporting us. So there's enough, I think, capacity in the NGO community to come together and to address this issue in specific contexts. And I think that's what I would welcome. And I think my work on this report shows the power of the NGO community. I work with the AJC in being able to access a wide range of actors from all parts of the world, from Australia, from South America, from Middle East, of course, North America and Western Europe, as well as I work with the WJC and the EJC, and again, accessing other communities. And in that process, I was able to really look at tons of work done by these communities, hundreds of hours of conversations, and then, of course, I think produce a report which I wouldn't have been able to do without that engagement and support. So I think there is power in the civil society communities, and there is power amongst NGOs, and we need to use them effectively. Thank you.
Felice, I'll now turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you very much, Dr. Shaheed. When Miguel Moratinos spoke to Advocacy Anywhere, he was asked about one of your recommendations, and he lit up and he said, and this is a direct quote because I looked it up last night, he said, Ahmed Shaheed made a fantastic report, a fantastic document that has inspired all of us. That was his direct quote. And I think today, Dr. Shaheed, you've shown us why and how your engagement with this issue has inspired so many people, your closeness to the issue, but your recognition that there is so much more to be done. You've really set out quite an agenda for future activity. We want to thank you. Thank you for the report. Thank you for this discussion today. Thank you for all the activity that's going to come and follow. We really look forward to hearing more from you on how and where combating anti-Semitism is going to be needed and effective. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on this platform. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Shaheed. Thank you, Felice. I would also like to thank our global audience for joining us. If you enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation to AJC at ajc.org/donate. Thank you again, everyone, and goodbye.